On a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan stands a limestone palace of such refined elegance that even a century later it stops traffic along North Lake Drive. 23 rooms spread across 13,717 square feet. Bedford limestone carved by hand on site. Wrought iron so intricate it took a master craftsman 3 years to complete. The mansion features a sweeping grand staircase, an Italian Renaissance fireplace built of Amherst sandstone, carved walnut doors opening to a French classical drawing room with canvas murals, and a Jacobean library with a Tudor arch fireplace. Cost in 1919, $500,000, the equivalent of nearly $10 million today. Herman Uihlein built this mansion when he was 32 years old. His father, Henry, had served as president of the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company for 4 decades. The Uihlein family had controlled Schlitz since 1875, transforming it from a Milwaukee brewery into the largest beer producer in the world. By 1947, Schlitz would be the largest brewery on the planet. The fortune seemed permanent. The mansion was built to last centuries, but fortunes are not made of limestone. Within 3 decades of Herman's death, the last Uihlein would lose control of Schlitz. The brewery would sell for a fraction of its worth to a competitor that would itself collapse. The empire that made Milwaukee famous destroyed itself through shortcuts that turned beer into sludge, illegal bribes to bar owners, and management decisions now studied in business schools as cautionary tales. The Schlitz Mistake, they call it now, a case study in how cost-cutting can obliterate a century of reputation. The mansion still stands. The brewery is gone. This is the story of both, and of what happens when you choose speed over craft, profit over quality, and quarterly margins over permanence. But to understand how the Uihleins built their palace, we must first understand the ground it stands on, because the irony begins before construction ever started. Before we dive into this story of brewing fortunes, limestone palaces, and a dynasty's spectacular collapse, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about America's lost industrial empires and the mansions they left behind, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into forgotten grandeur. Chapter 1. The Rival's Pleasure Garden. In 1888, Captain Frederick Pabst opened a resort on the shore of Lake Michigan. The Pabst Whitefish Bay Resort occupied 18 acres of waterfront property, a few miles north of downtown Milwaukee. The lakefront location offered what Milwaukee's industrial center could not: clean air, open water, and an escape from the smokestacks that defined the city's skyline. Visitors arrived by carriage, by train, and by steamboat to enjoy the resort's amenities. The main building housed lounging parlors decorated in Victorian fashion. Dining rooms served meals prepared by trained chefs, but the centerpiece was a circular beer bar positioned to offer unobstructed views of Lake Michigan. Visitors could drink Pabst beer while watching sailboats and steamers cross the water. The message was clear: Pabst Brewing Wealth had purchased this paradise, and Pabst customers were welcome to enjoy it. A Ferris wheel turned slowly above the grounds, offering elevated views of the lake and the Milwaukee skyline in the distance. Walking paths wound through landscaped gardens. The resort hosted picnics, parties, and celebrations throughout the warmer months. Families came for day trips. Couples arrived for romantic dinners. The resort operated as both a public attraction and a sophisticated advertisement for the Pabst brand. Captain Frederick Pabst was one of Milwaukee's brewing barons. His company competed directly with the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company for market dominance in an industry that was making both families extraordinarily wealthy. The rivalry was fierce but remained civil. The two breweries battled for distribution contracts, advertising space, and consumer loyalty. Business was business. Money was money. The resort operated successfully for 26 years, generating revenue and enhancing Pabst's reputation as a company that understood the good life. By 1914, the pleasure garden era was ending. Prohibition loomed on the horizon. The 18th Amendment was being debated in state legislatures across the country. Public tastes were changing. Temperance movements were gaining political power. The resort closed, and the land was subdivided the following year into residential plots. What had been a public beer garden would become private estates for Milwaukee's wealthiest families. The lakefront property that had drawn thousands of beer-drinking visitors would now house mansions for the industrial elite. The irony of this transformation, beer money turning beer gardens into sober residential neighborhoods, was not lost on anyone paying attention. But a deeper irony was about to unfold. Herman Uihlein purchased the first plot in 1915. 3 acres on the bluff, overlooking the water where steamboats had once delivered Pabst's customers. He paid a premium for the location. The lakefront commanded the highest prices in the subdivision. Herman wanted the best land available. The irony was difficult to miss. The son of the Schlitz Brewing president was buying land from his father's main competitor to build what would become the grandest residence in the new subdivision. The Schlitz heir would wake every morning on land that had been Pabst resort property. The breakfast table would overlook a view that Pabst had claimed first. Every dollar Herman spent on construction would flow from Schlitz profits into development of former Pabst territory. But the connection between the families ran deeper than business rivalry. Captain Pabst's son Fred had married Ida Uihlein, connecting the two brewing dynasties through marriage even as they competed for market share. Herman Uihlein's cousin became a Pabst. The families fought in boardrooms and celebrated at weddings. Children from both clans grew up attending the same social events, joining the same clubs, and inheriting stakes in competing breweries. The rivalry was genuine. The connections were complex. Now a Schlitz heir would build his palace on Pabst resort land. The architects would be the same firm that designed Schlitz projects. The craftsmen would include artisans Pabst had brought to Milwaukee, and the fortune-funding construction came from the competitor that had battled Pabst for decades. What Herman Uihlein planned was permanence. What he would build was a palace that outlasted the fortune that paid for it. But in 1915, as he signed purchase documents for 3 acres of premium lakefront, the future was unknowable. The mansion existed only in his wife's imagination. Chapter 2. The President's Son. Herman Uihlein was born into an empire in 1886. His father Henry controlled the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, along with 3 brothers, August, Alfred, and Edward. But the Uihlein ownership of Schlitz had begun a decade before Herman's birth, rooted in death and opportunity. The story was a German immigrant tale of industry, tragedy, and calculated succession. August Krug founded the brewery in 1849 in Milwaukee, a city filling with German immigrants seeking opportunity in America. Krug was a Bavarian who understood brewing. His nephew, 16-year-old August Uihlein, arrived from Germany in 1854 and began working at the brewery in 1861. The young man learned every aspect of the business from grain purchasing to fermentation to distribution. Joseph Schlitz, another German immigrant from Mainz, had joined as bookkeeper in 1850. When Krug died unexpectedly in 1856, Schlitz took over management. 2 years later, he married Krug's widow, Anna Maria, acquiring both the business and the family in one decisive move. The brewery was renamed Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company in 1874. In 1875, Schlitz sailed to Germany on business. The SS Schiller was a modern steamship, considered safe and reliable. On May 7th, the ship struck rocks near the Isles of Scilly off the Cornwall coast in heavy fog. The Schiller sank rapidly. Schlitz drowned along with 334 other passengers and crew. His body was never recovered. The sea claimed the brewery owner at age 45. Schlitz had prepared for this possibility. His will specified that the Uihlein brothers should run the brewery if he died. Management passed immediately to August, Henry, Alfred, and Edward per Schlitz's explicit written instructions. The transition was seamless. The brothers expanded production, invested in new technologies, and built national distribution networks. When Anna Maria Schlitz died in 1887, the Uihleins acquired complete ownership through inheritance provisions Schlitz had established. They kept the Schlitz name because Americans had difficulty pronouncing Uihlein. The marketing value of name recognition outweighed family pride. Henry Uihlein became president. He would hold that position for 41 years, from 1875 until 1916. Under his leadership, Schlitz grew from a regional Milwaukee brewery serving German immigrant neighborhoods into the largest beer producer in America, shipping coast to coast and competing with giants like Anheuser-Busch and Pabst for market supremacy. The fortune accumulated across decades of expansion, technological innovation, and aggressive marketing. Herman grew up watching his father build an empire. He lived in a Milwaukee mansion, attended elite private schools, and understood from childhood that his family controlled one of America's most successful corporations. But Henry Uihlein did not raise his son to be a brewer. Herman was educated to be a gentleman businessman, capable of managing any enterprise. He attended Cornell University, graduating in 1908 with a degree that emphasized business administration and leadership. The Cornell education connected him to America's industrial elite. He spent 2 years studying law at Columbia University in New York, absorbing legal frameworks and contracts. He never practiced law. The education was about understanding power, not representing clients. In 1911, at age 25, Herman was appointed president of the newly formed Levine Gear Company, which manufactured steering gears for the booming automobile and truck industry. This was Herman's own fortune, separate from the brewing money. His father may have facilitated the appointment, but Herman proved himself capable. The Levine Gear Company was capitalized at $40,000 in 1911. By 1918, the year Herman began building his mansion, the company had amassed $1 million in capital. Herman had grown his business 25-fold in 7 years through the expanding automobile industry. America was falling in love with motorized vehicles. Herman sold them the components that made steering possible. He served on the Schlitz board of directors but was not involved in daily brewery operations. His wealth came from manufacturing, not beer. This distinction mattered. Herman was not dependent on his father. He had built something himself. In 1915, Herman married Claudia Holt. She came from Milwaukee wealth and had traveled extensively in Europe during the early years of the 20th century, before the Great War closed the continent to American tourists. She had visited Italy, France, and Austria. She had toured Renaissance villas in Tuscany, classical estates outside Paris, and Baroque palaces in Vienna. She had collected ideas about architecture, design, materials, and refined living. She knew exactly what sophisticated European wealth looked like, and she wanted to recreate it in Wisconsin. In 1917, their son Herman Alfred Uihlein Jr. was born. A daughter, also named Claudia, followed. The family was established. The business was thriving. The lakefront property awaited construction. Herman Uihlein, at age 29, possessed what few men could claim: independent wealth from successful business leadership, family wealth from the largest brewery in America, a sophisticated wife with European taste, 2 healthy children, and 3 acres of prime lakefront property purchased from a competitor's failed resort. The resources existed to build something extraordinary. Claudia knew exactly what refinement looked like. The architects would translate her vision into limestone. Chapter 3: Limestone and Iron. In 1915, Herman Uihlein purchased 3 acres on a bluff. By 1917, his wife Claudia had determined exactly what would rise there. The plans were drawn to her specifications. She had traveled Europe in the early 1900s, visiting palaces and villas, studying Italian Renaissance architecture and French classical design. She had examined materials, proportions, ornamentation, and spatial relationships. The mansion would reflect that education. This was Claudia's vision as much as Herman's fortune. Herman hired the architectural firm of Kirchhoff and Rose. The partnership had been formed in 1894 between Charles Kirchhoff and Thomas Leslie Rose, both trained in classical architectural traditions. Charles died in 1915. His son Roger succeeded him, and the firm continued under the same name, maintaining relationships and contracts the elder Kirchhoff had established. Kirchhoff and Rose were the preferred architects for Schlitz projects. They had designed tied house taverns for the brewery across the Midwest, the Tivoli Palm Gardens in Milwaukee, and residential projects for other Uihlein family members. They understood what the family wanted: quality, permanence, and a synthesis of European refinement with American scale. Thomas Rose worked directly with Claudia to execute her vision. The collaboration between architect and client lasted months. Every detail was discussed, revised, and specified. The plans eventually filled 134 pages. Room dimensions, ceiling heights, window placements, material selections, ornamentation patterns, all were documented with precision. The style would blend Italian Renaissance revival with Beaux-Arts elements, a synthesis of classical motifs rendered in lavish materials. This was not copying a single European building, but creating an original composition informed by classical precedent. The exterior would be constructed of Bedford limestone, quarried in south-central Indiana and shipped by rail to Milwaukee. Bedford limestone was America's premier building stone, used for the Empire State Building, the Pentagon, and countless institutional and residential projects requiring durability and refinement. The stone would be delivered as rough blocks. All ornamentation, carved window surrounds, decorative panels, cornices, and sculptural elements would be carved on site by craftsmen working directly from architectural drawings. This method ensured precision and allowed adjustments during construction. Construction began in 1918. The location presented immediate challenges. Whitefish Bay in 1918 was not the developed suburb it would later become. The area was largely farms and open land. Roads were unpaved or non-existent. Sidewalks had not been installed. Utility infrastructure had not reached the northern suburbs. The Uihleins would be building among agricultural properties where cows still grazed and crops were harvested. Delivering materials required creating temporary roads. Limestone blocks arrived by rail at Milwaukee depots, then had to be transported by wagon to the construction site. The same logistics applied to lumber, hardware, fixtures, and the thousands of components required to build a mansion. Workers faced mud in spring, dust in summer, and cold in late fall, as construction stretched across seasons. When the Uihleins eventually moved into the completed mansion in 1919, they would be living in what one historian later described as isolation. The house ran on bottled gas because natural gas lines had not yet reached the area. Electricity was available, but water and sewer connections required special arrangements. The family was building a palace in what was still partially wilderness. The scale of the project required master craftsmen. Claudia and Herman wanted more than a large house. They wanted art rendered in limestone, wood, and iron. Two names would become synonymous with the mansion's quality: Matthews Brothers and Cyril Colnik. Matthews Brothers Manufacturing Company had been founded in Milwaukee in 1857 by English immigrant William Matthews. For over 60 years, the firm had produced high-grade architectural woodwork for Milwaukee's finest buildings. They employed European-trained craftsmen who understood traditional joinery, carving, and finishing techniques. They would handle all interior woodwork for the Uihlein mansion. The walnut floors would be pegged using traditional methods rather than nailed, ensuring durability and allowing future repairs without replacement. The carved walnut doors would feature hand-carved panels depicting classical motifs. The Jacobean library paneling would be assembled from individually crafted boards, each fitted precisely to create seamless walls that appeared to be solid wood. Matthews Brothers brought old-world craftsmanship to American millwork, and the Uihlein mansion would showcase their finest work. Cyril Colnik was different. He was not a company, but a single artist working in iron, and his story was inseparable from Milwaukee's brewing history. Colnik had been born in Treben, Austria in 1871. He studied ironwork in Vienna under masters who taught techniques dating to the Renaissance. He continued his education at the Munich Industrial Art School, absorbing both traditional craft and emerging design philosophies. In 1893, at age 22, he accompanied his teacher to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago as part of the German ironworking team representing European metalcraft. His masterwork at the exposition, a massive decorative grille depicting Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, surrounded by flames and industrial motifs, won a gold medal. The piece demonstrated not just technical skill, but artistic vision. Colnik could make iron look like flowing fabric, could create depth and movement in flat metal, could forge pieces so intricate they appeared too delicate to be structural. At the exposition, he met Captain Frederick Pabst, who had come to Chicago to promote Pabst beer and scout for talent. Pabst convinced the young Austrian craftsman to settle in Milwaukee. The pitch was straightforward. Milwaukee had a large German population, wealthy families building mansions, and a brewing industry generating fortunes that demanded expression in architecture and decoration. An ironworker of Colnik's talent could build both a business and a reputation. The irony was remarkable. Pabst had recruited Colnik to Milwaukee decades earlier. Colnik had created ironwork for the Pabst Mansion and other Pabst projects. Now Colnik was creating ironwork for a Schlitz mansion being built on Pabst's former resort land. The rivalries and connections between these families created patterns that repeated through generations and trades. Colnik opened his ornamental iron shop on North 3rd Street in 1894. For 6 decades, he would be Milwaukee's preeminent ironworker, called the Tiffany of wrought iron by admirers who understood that comparison meant more than praise. It meant Colnik had elevated a craft into fine art. He created gates, balustrades, chandeliers, and decorative grills for the Pabst Mansion, the Trostel Mansion, the Puelischer Mansion, and most of Milwaukee's wealthy families. Architects specified Colnik ironwork in their plans the way they might specify marble or mahogany. The Uihlein Commission consumed 3 years of Colnik's life. The sweeping grand staircase required an ornate wrought iron railing that would curve elegantly from the first floor to the second. The design incorporated flowing organic forms, vines, leaves, and abstract botanical elements that appeared to grow from the newel posts. Each baluster was individually forged and fitted. The composition had to be both structural and decorative, capable of supporting human weight while appearing delicate enough to be filigree. The front door needed an elaborate grille that would allow light to enter while maintaining security and privacy. Colnik designed a geometric pattern based on Renaissance precedents, forging the iron into interlocking shapes that created visual complexity. Additional decorative ironwork would appear in light fixtures, door hardware, window guards, and exterior railings. Colnik worked slowly, forging each element by hand in his shop. He used techniques of repoussé, hammering metal from the reverse side to create raised designs, and detailed naturalism that required heating, hammering, bending, and fitting iron repeatedly until shapes emerged. Modern ironwork could be cast in molds or fabricated from stock components. Colnik's methods were medieval. Every piece was unique, every curve was deliberate, every joint was fitted by eye and hand. 3 years to complete ironwork for a single house was extraordinary even for elaborate mansions. It demonstrated both the complexity of Colnik's designs and the Uihlein's willingness to wait for perfection. Construction schedules could not rush an artist. The limestone could be carved while Colnik forged. The mansion would be finished when the ironwork was ready, not before. The mansion took shape across 1918 and 1919. The limestone exterior rose first, carved blocks stacked and mortared into walls 3 stories high. The roof was tiled in Mediterranean fashion with terracotta. The interior featured a central hall dominated by the grand staircase that would receive Colnik's masterwork. An Italian Renaissance fireplace built of Amherst sandstone anchored the space, carved with classical motifs and fitted with a bronze screen. Carved walnut doors opened to a French classical drawing room with herringbone parquet floors and canvas murals depicting pastoral European scenes. The library was Jacobean in style, with a Tudor arched fireplace and dark wood paneling. Coffered ceilings with decorative plasterwork covered many rooms, creating visual depth overhead. Marble and hardwood floors ran throughout. The house contained 23 rooms, 9 bedrooms, and 8 bathrooms across 13,717 square feet of finished space. The cost reached $500,000 by completion. A Model T Ford cost $500 in 1919. The Uihleins had spent the equivalent of 1,000 automobiles on their house. Adjusted for inflation, the expenditure approached $10 million in contemporary dollars. But inflation calculations missed the point. The Uihleins were not spending money. They were commissioning permanents. By 1919, construction was complete. The family moved into a palace built among farms, surrounded by ironwork that had taken longer to create than Herman had spent at Cornell, resting on foundations sunk deep into land where beer-drinking tourists had once watched the Ferris wheel turn. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. For entertaining, the mansion served perfectly. For the next 2 decades, the formal spaces fulfilled their intended purpose. The formal drawing room with its French classical proportions and canvas murals hosted afternoon teas and evening receptions. The paneled dining hall accommodated dinner parties for Milwaukee's industrial elite. The gracious tea room provided an intimate space for smaller gatherings. The Jacobean Library offered a masculine retreat where men could discuss business over brandy and cigars. Each space was designed for specific social functions, and the Uihleins used them all. Milwaukee society came to the limestone palace on the bluff. Guest lists included other brewing families, industrial executives, political figures, and cultural leaders. The Uihleins were not just wealthy, they were positioned at the intersection of Milwaukee's most powerful networks. Schlitz connected them to the brewing industry. Herman's manufacturing business connected them to automobile suppliers and industrial engineers. Family marriages connected them to competitors. The mansion provided a stage where these networks could interact over carefully prepared meals served on Wedgwood china. 3 bedrooms on the second floor housed live-in servants. Additional staff quarters existed elsewhere in the house. Managing 13,717 square feet required constant labor. A butler oversaw household operations, coordinating staff schedules and ensuring the house ran smoothly. A cook prepared meals using ingredients delivered daily to the service entrance. Maids maintained the rooms, dusting carved woodwork, polishing marble floors, and changing linens. A groundskeeper tended the 3 acres, maintaining lawns, gardens, and the long driveway that curved up to the front entrance. A driver handled transportation, maintaining the family's automobiles and providing chauffeur service when needed. The staff likely numbered between 6 and 8 full-time employees, a modest number for a house this size, but sufficient given the relative isolation of Whitefish Bay in the 1920s. Larger estates employed dozens. The Uihleins maintained efficiency without sacrificing quality of service. The household ran like a small business because it was a small business, consuming resources and producing the social capital that came from proper entertaining. Herman's daily life centered on business. He ran the Levine Gear Company from offices in Milwaukee's industrial district. The company later became known as Ben-Hur Manufacturing, expanding beyond steering gears into other automotive components. Herman served as president until his death, overseeing production, negotiating contracts, and managing workers who depended on his company for employment. The 1920s were boom years for automobile manufacturing. Demand for steering components grew as America fell in love with motorized transportation. Herman's separate fortune grew alongside the brewing money. He also served on the board of the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, though he remained distant from daily brewery operations. Board meetings required his attendance. Dividend checks arrived quarterly. Family gatherings discussed brewery strategy, but Herman was not a brewer. The brewing fortune existed as background wealth, reassuring and permanent, while his focus was the manufacturing business he had built himself. Claudia managed the household. She oversaw the staff, planned social events, selected menus, and maintained the mansion as a showcase for the European furnishings and art she had collected during her travels. The drawing room displayed fine china purchased in Paris. The dining room featured Baccarat crystal from France, Wedgwood services, Meissen lamps, hand-painted Nippon vases. The collection reflected decades of refined taste and substantial expenditure. Every object had a story. Every purchase represented a choice Claudia had made to bring European sophistication to Milwaukee. The mansion was Claudia's domain. Herman earned the money. Claudia determined how it would be displayed and what it would mean. This division was typical for wealthy families of the era, but Claudia exercised more control than most wives were permitted. The mansion reflected her vision, her travels, her aesthetic education. Visitors complimented Claudia, not Herman, on the home's beauty. Their children grew up in extraordinary privilege. Herman Jr., born in 1917, and his sister Claudia experienced childhoods insulated from ordinary concerns. They attended Milwaukee's most exclusive private schools. The mansion grounds offered space for recreation, lawn games, exploring the bluff, watching boats on Lake Michigan. Summers might include travel or time at other family properties. The children learned early that their last name meant something in Milwaukee, that doors opened for Uihleins, that wealth was not just about money, but about position and expectation. The neighborhood developed around them. The farms gradually disappeared as more families purchased subdivision plots and built homes. Roads were paved with asphalt. Sidewalks appeared, connecting properties. Utility lines reached Whitefish Bay, and the mansion transitioned from bottled gas to connected natural gas service. The isolation that had defined the early years faded. By the 1930s, Whitefish Bay was becoming a proper suburb, still exclusive, still expensive, but no longer remote. Other wealthy families built homes nearby, though none approached the scale or refinement of the Uihlein residence. The limestone palace remained the standard against which other houses were judged. Architects brought clients to view it from the street, pointing out the carved stone, the proportions, the quality of execution. The mansion became a landmark even while occupied, recognized as exceptional by people who understood architecture. Herman Uihlein died in 1942 at age 56. The cause was not recorded in available documents, suggesting either sudden illness or perhaps a condition the family kept private. He simply died, leaving Claudia a widow at 56 in a 23-room mansion designed for entertaining crowds. She chose to stay. For 4 more years, she lived in the house they had built together. Surrounded by European collections and memories of 2 decades of hosting Milwaukee society, the staff likely diminished. The social calendar certainly contracted. A widow alone in a palace designed for crowds must have experienced the space differently. Rooms that once felt elegant now felt empty, silence replacing conversation, solitude replacing society. But Claudia stayed, maintaining the household, preserving what they had created. In 1946, Claudia made her decision. She would leave the mansion and move to more manageable accommodations. The house would be sold. But before leaving, she made arrangements for what mattered most to her, the European collections she had spent decades assembling. Chapter 5. Empire at its Peak. In 1902, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company became the largest beer producer in the United States. The achievement represented the culmination of 27 years of Uihlein management. The brothers who had inherited the brewery from Joseph Schlitz had transformed it through innovation, expansion, and aggressive marketing into an industrial giant that defined Milwaukee's identity. The innovations began early. In the 1870s and 80s, the Uihleins introduced pasteurization for bottled beer, a process that extended shelf life dramatically and made long-distance shipping viable. Before pasteurization, beer spoiled quickly. Breweries served local markets because transportation destroyed the product. Pasteurization changed everything. Schlitz could ship beer to California, Florida, New York, anywhere rail lines reached, and the product would arrive drinkable. National distribution became possible. In 1912, Schlitz began using brown glass bottles, a revolutionary change from the clear glass that allowed sunlight to spoil beer's flavor through a chemical reaction brewers called skunking. The brown glass filtered ultraviolet light, protecting the beer. Competitors initially resisted the change, preferring transparent bottles that showed the beer's color and clarity. Within 5 years, the entire brewing industry adopted brown bottles. Schlitz had set the standard again. The innovation was simple, colored glass, but the impact was industry-wide. Distribution networks spread across the United States like roots seeking water. The Uihleins established agencies in every major city, hiring local distributors who understood regional markets and could navigate state and local regulations. They helped establish the Union Refrigerator Transit Company in the 1890s, a cooperative effort among brewers to build refrigerated rail cars that could transport beer without spoilage. The wooden rail cars were insulated with cork, lined with metal, and filled with ice to maintain temperatures during transcontinental journeys. The technical and logistical innovations made national distribution not just possible, but profitable. Marketing campaigns promoted Schlitz aggressively. The slogan, "The beer that made Milwaukee famous," appeared on advertisements, billboards, and promotional materials across the country. The message linked Schlitz to Milwaukee's identity, suggesting that drinking Schlitz connected consumers to something authentic and traditional. Another advertising line became cultural shorthand. Quote 2, "The implication was direct. Schlitz was not just a brand, but the category itself." Prohibition arrived in 1920 and lasted 13 years. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act made manufacturing, transporting, and selling alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. Breweries faced extinction. The Uihleins survived by pivoting production immediately. Schlitz produced near beer, a malt beverage with less than 0.5% alcohol that technically complied with Prohibition laws. The product tasted like beer because it was beer with the alcohol removed through heating or vacuum distillation. Consumers tolerated it. Revenue from near beer was a fraction of what beer had generated, but it kept the brewery operating. Soft drinks, malt syrup, and other legal products supplemented near beer revenue. The brewery sold malt syrup for baking, which consumers could also use for home brewing. A wink and nod acknowledgement that Prohibition had not killed demand, only driven it underground. In 1919, Joseph Uihlein Sr. created a chocolate division, producing candy under the brand name Uihlein, the phonetic pronunciation of Uihlein. The venture was ambitious. The Uihleins believed they could apply brewing precision and quality control to chocolate manufacturing. The chocolate venture failed spectacularly. Hershey dominated the American chocolate market through economies of scale and established distribution. Uihlein suffered quality control problems. Batches spoiled, flavors were inconsistent, and consumers preferred familiar brands. The division lost millions of dollars. The Uihleins absorbed the losses and abandoned chocolate by 1928. But the brewery survived Prohibition by maintaining operations and keeping skilled workers employed during 13 years when brewing was illegal. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Schlitz roared back. The company launched an acquisition and expansion plan that propelled it from survival mode to dominance. New breweries were constructed. Distribution networks were rebuilt and expanded. Advertising campaigns celebrated the return of real beer. Marketing emphasized continuity. Schlitz had survived, Schlitz had waited, Schlitz was back. By 1947, Schlitz was the largest brewery in the world. Revenue reached into the billions. The company employed thousands of workers directly and supported tens of thousands more through suppliers, distributors, and retailers. Schlitz traded the top position with Anheuser-Busch through the 1940s and 50s, each claiming dominance in different years depending on how production was measured. Being number one or number two barely mattered. Both companies were giants. Herman Uihlein lived through this golden age in his limestone mansion. The empire his father had built continued growing under his cousins and other family members who managed daily operations. Herman served on the board, attended meetings, collected dividends, and watched Schlitz become a global brand. The brewing fortune was background wealth, reassuring and permanent, while Herman focused on his own manufacturing business. Leadership passed through generations. August Uihlein served as chairman until his death in 1911. Henry Uihlein was president until 1916. Alfred Uihlein succeeded him and served until 1926. Joseph Uihlein Sr. and then Irwin Uihlein led the company through Prohibition and the post-repeal boom. Robert Uihlein Sr. served as vice president and secretary. The family maintained control for 3 generations through a combination of shared ownership, blood relationships, and a commitment to continuity over disruption. By 1957, a crucial shift occurred. Anheuser-Busch's Budweiser brand took the lead in market share and never relinquished it. The advertising was relentless. The distribution was impeccable. The product was consistent. Budweiser became America's beer. Schlitz was permanently relegated to second place. The gap widened through the late 50s and early 60s. Market share slipped year by year. Not catastrophically, but steadily, like a boat taking on water. New competitors emerged. Miller Brewing, backed by Philip Morris tobacco money, launched an aggressive expansion using marketing techniques borrowed from cigarettes. Miller Lite would later revolutionize the industry by creating the light beer category. Competitors were innovating while Schlitz defended territory. Robert Uihlein Jr. inherited leadership of the company in 1961, becoming president. In 1967, he became chairman. He was August Uihlein's grandson, representing the third generation of family control. He faced challenges his grandfather and father had never encountered. Budweiser was winning on quality and consistency. Miller was gaining through innovation and aggressive marketing. The pressure to compete, to cut costs, to protect profit margins, to deliver quarterly results to shareholders, to prove the family could still lead, all of it fell on Robert. The pressure was mounting. The solution seemed obvious. Cut costs, protect margins, maintain profitability. The rational decision would destroy everything. Chapter 6. The Schlitz Mistake. Robert Uihlein Jr. faced a problem that money alone could not solve. Budweiser had taken permanent market leadership in 1957 and was extending its advantage. Miller was launching products like light beer and capturing new market segments with sophisticated advertising campaigns. Schlitz was losing ground despite massive advertising budgets and national distribution infrastructure. The company's profit margins were being squeezed by rising ingredient costs, labor costs, and marketing expenses necessary to compete. Robert believed he could not beat Anheuser-Busch on market share. They were too large, too well-funded, too entrenched, but he could improve Schlitz's profitability through cost reduction. The strategy seemed sound. If drinkers would not notice small changes, the company could cut ingredient costs incrementally and protect margins while remaining competitive on price. Wall Street would reward efficiency. Quarterly earnings would improve. The Uihlein family would prove it could manage a modern corporation facing modern competition. The decision would destroy the empire in less than a decade. The cost-cutting began in 1967 with a new brewing process called accelerated batch fermentation. Traditional brewing methods required weeks of careful fermentation as yeast converted sugars to alcohol. The process could not be rushed without affecting flavor, complexity, and character. Accelerated fermentation used different yeast strains and higher temperatures to shorten the process dramatically, allowing Schlitz to produce more beer with the same equipment in less time. Costs per barrel dropped. Production capacity increased, efficiency improved, but the beer changed. The flavor profile lost complexity. The mouthfeel became thinner. The character that distinguished Schlitz from competitors diminished with each batch. Chemical analysis might show the alcohol content was correct, but sensory analysis, actual human tasting, revealed something had been lost. Robert instructed his brewers to replace expensive malted barley with cheaper corn syrup. Barley provides proteins, enzymes, and flavors essential to beer character. Corn syrup provides sugar for fermentation but contributes less flavor. The substitution saved money. The beer became blander. Hop pellets were substituted for whole hops, reducing costs but changing aromatic qualities. Each individual change seemed minor. Together they altered the fundamental character of the beer. Drinkers noticed immediately. Sales began declining in the early 1970s. Consumers complained that Schlitz tasted different, that something had changed, that the beer was not what it used to be. But Robert pressed forward, convinced the complaints were exaggerated, that consumers would adjust, that cost savings would eventually translate to competitive advantage. Another cost-cutting measure was introduced to address a technical problem. Schlitz aged its beer less than competitors, which caused proteins to form a haze when the beer was chilled. Hazy beer looks spoiled even when perfectly safe to drink. To prevent haze formation, brewers added silica gel during the brewing process. The gel bonded with proteins, preventing haze, and was filtered out before bottling. It was perfectly safe. It was FDA approved. It was also a public relations disaster waiting to happen. The Food and Drug Administration began requiring more detailed ingredient labeling in the mid-1970s. If Schlitz had to list silica gel on its bottles, while Anheuser-Busch listed only traditional ingredients like water, barley, hops, and yeast, consumers would question what they were drinking. The marketing implications were catastrophic. Schlitz frantically searched for an alternative. They replaced silica gel with a different chemical agent that could be completely filtered out, leaving no trace and requiring no label disclosure. The switch was implemented quickly in early 1976 without adequate testing. The brewers believed they had solved the problem. They had created a catastrophe. Millions of bottles and cans produced with the new process developed a flaky, hazy appearance within weeks of packaging. The beer looked spoiled. Small white particles floated in the liquid like snow in a snow globe. The beer was perfectly safe to drink. Lab tests confirmed it, but it appeared tainted. Consumers called it snot beer. Retailers refused to stock it. Bars opened cases, saw the appearance, and sent entire shipments back. The scandal spread through the industry faster than Schlitz could respond. Schlitz attempted to secretly recall and destroy the affected batches. Trucks collected cases from distributors under cover of night. Bottles were smashed and discarded. Cans were crushed and melted. The effort failed to contain the damage. News of the recall leaked to journalists and competitors. The cost exceeded $1,400,000 in direct expenses, an enormous sum for a recall, but the financial loss was trivial compared to the reputational destruction. The public humiliation was worse than any financial loss. The beer that made Milwaukee famous had become a national joke. Late-night television hosts made Schlitz the punchline. Comedians described the beer as undrinkable. Consumers shared stories of opening Schlitz bottles and seeing floating particles. The brand reputation that had been built over a century collapsed in months. Market share fell like a stone thrown from a bridge. Schlitz fell from second place nationally to third, then fourth, then fifth within just a few years. Between 1974 and 1982, the company lost 90% of its stock market value. Billions of dollars in shareholder wealth evaporated. Competitors seized the opportunity. Miller's light beer captured the market segment Schlitz was abandoning. Pabst overtook Schlitz in market share. Even smaller regional brewers like G. Heilemann Brewing Company passed the failing giant. A separate scandal emerged simultaneously, compounding the damage. Federal prosecutors charged Schlitz with illegally bribing bar owners and distributors to secure tap placements and shelf space. The payola scheme had operated for years across multiple states, funneling money through advertising agencies and front companies to hide the payments. Schlitz had been buying market share through illegal cash while simultaneously destroying product quality through cost-cutting. The company was collapsing from multiple self-inflicted wounds: bad beer, illegal bribes, and evaporated consumer trust. Robert Uihlein Jr. died in 1976 of leukemia at age 60. He died believing the damage could be contained, that product improvements would restore the brand, that the family legacy would survive. It would not. Leadership passed outside the Uihlein family for the first time since 1875. The family that had controlled Schlitz for 101 years lost control in the same year Robert died. The empire built by four brothers who inherited a brewery from a shipwreck victim was destroyed by a grandson's cost-cutting in less than a decade. Chapter 7. Limestone Endures. While the Schlitz empire collapsed in boardrooms and breweries, the mansion Herman Uihlein had built was being quietly preserved by people who had nothing to do with beer. Claudia Uihlein sold the property in 1946 to Central Office Buildings Incorporated, a Milwaukee real estate holding company that specialized in commercial and residential investments. The firm held the mansion for 7 years as investment property, likely renting it to wealthy tenants who could afford the maintenance costs and appreciated living in Milwaukee's grandest residence. In 1953, Central Office Buildings sold to an unusual buyer, the La Salette Fathers, a Catholic religious order founded in France in 1851. The order was named for the village of La Salette in the French Alps, where 2 children reportedly witnessed an apparition of the Virgin Mary in 1846. The La Salette Fathers focused on missionary work, education, and spiritual retreats. They purchased the Uihlein mansion to serve as a mission house for 5 priests and 2 brothers working in the Milwaukee area. The limestone palace became institutional religious property, a transformation that typically destroys historic homes. Institutional owners subdivide large rooms to create offices and dormitories, install cheap fixtures to reduce costs, defer maintenance to preserve budgets, and prioritize function over aesthetics. Churches, schools, and nonprofits rarely have resources or incentives to preserve architectural refinement. The La Salette Fathers did none of this. For approximately 25 years, the mansion served religious purposes while maintaining its architectural integrity. The priests and brothers apparently understood they were stewards of something significant. The ironwork remained intact. The limestone exterior was maintained. The carved woodwork was preserved. The mansion was used but not degraded. What daily life looked like during this period remains unclear from available records. Did the priests celebrate Mass in the drawing room? Did they convert bedrooms to private cells? Did they host retreats where Catholics from Milwaukee came to the mansion for spiritual guidance? The details are lost, but the physical evidence is clear. When the La Salette Fathers eventually sold the property in the late 1970s, the mansion had not been damaged by institutional use. This outcome was rare enough to be remarkable. In the late 1970s, the Grant C. Beutner family purchased the mansion, returning it to private residential use after a quarter-century of religious ownership. The Beutners were not just wealthy buyers seeking a lakefront estate. They understood what they had acquired and immediately began working to protect it through historic designation. Grant Beutner championed the campaign to secure National Register status. The process required extensive documentation, architectural drawings, historical research, photographs, and written justification demonstrating the property's significance. Beutner worked with historians and preservation specialists to compile the nomination. In 1983, the mansion was officially placed on the National Register of Historic Places, a federal designation administered by the National Park Service. The National Register listing provided legal protection and public recognition. Property owners could not demolish or significantly alter listed buildings without regulatory review. Federal tax incentives became available for appropriate rehabilitation work. The designation also marked the mansion as historically significant, worthy of preservation for future generations. Wisconsin added the mansion to the State Register of Historic Places in 1989, providing additional state-level protection. Whitefish Bay later designated it an official village landmark, adding local oversight to federal and state protections. The layered designations created a preservation framework that would protect the mansion even as ownership changed and decades passed. The National Register nomination described the mansion as distinguished by an academic synthesis of Renaissance revival and Beaux-Arts motifs, a lavishly ornamented interior displaying the talents of master craftsmen, and a commanding presence on the lakefront. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. This building represented the best of American residential architecture from the early 20th century, a period when wealth was translated into permanent objects rather than financial instruments. In 1988, Stephen and Christiana Nicolay purchased the property from the Beutners. The Nicolays invested heavily in maintenance and renovations, updating systems while preserving historic character. Modern heating, air conditioning, and electrical systems were installed. Bathrooms were upgraded. The kitchen received new appliances. After approximately 1 year of improvements, the Nicolets sold at a profit to the mansion's most famous owner. The next occupant would be the son of a man whose wealth would eventually exceed the entire Schlitz Brewing fortune at its peak. The next owner would put the Whitefish Bay address on the international map for reasons that had nothing to do with brewing or limestone or European collections. He would put a recording studio on the third floor and compose an Oscar-winning song in a bedroom where Herman and Claudia Uihlein had once slept. Chapter 8. The billionaire's son, Peter Buffett, bought the mansion in 1989 for reasons that had nothing to do with brewing history or architectural preservation. He was the son of Warren Buffett, the Omaha-based investor whose disciplined value investing philosophy was building a fortune that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. But Peter was not an investor. He had deliberately chosen a different path. He was a musician and composer, and he needed space to work. The Limestone Palace offered space, acoustic isolation, and a location separate from his father's world of finance. Peter had grown up in Omaha, attended Stanford University briefly, and pursued music against conventional expectations for a Buffett child. He composed for film and television, creating scores and original music for various projects that paid modestly but allowed creative freedom. He was building a career based on talent rather than inheritance. The mansion's third floor could accommodate professional recording equipment. Peter installed mixing consoles, soundboards, microphones, acoustic panels, and specialized machinery necessary for professional music production. The bedrooms became a working studio. The acoustic properties of the mansion, thick limestone walls, solid construction, minimal external noise from the still quiet Whitefish Bay neighborhood, created an ideal environment for recording. Peter lived and worked in the mansion for 3 years, composing in rooms where Herman Uihlein had slept, recording in spaces designed for servants, creating modern art in a building dedicated to classical European refinement. In 1990, he received a commission that would bring unexpected international attention to the Milwaukee address. Kevin Costner was directing and starring in Dances with Wolves, an epic western about a Union Army lieutenant who befriends a Lakota Sioux tribe during the 1860s. The film was ambitious, a 3-hour meditation on cultural collision, friendship across racial divides, and the destruction of indigenous peoples. The project was risky. Hollywood had declared Westerns commercially dead. Costner was gambling his reputation. The film required an original score that could carry emotional weight without overwhelming the visuals. Costner's team reached out to Peter Buffett. The commission was specific: create music that suggested the American frontier, Native American culture, and the tragedy of inevitable collision between civilizations. Peter composed in his third-floor studio, working with synthesizers and traditional instruments to build soundscapes. One piece, titled Quote 4, became central to the film's emotional arc. The composition blended electronic and organic sounds, creating something that felt both timeless and modern. The music captured movement, ritual, celebration, and the underlying tension of cultures meeting. When Dances with Wolves premiered, Fire Dance played during a pivotal scene where the Lakota perform a ceremonial dance celebrating a successful buffalo hunt. The music made the scene unforgettable. Dances with Wolves became a phenomenon when it was released in late 1990. The film grossed over $400 million worldwide. It won 7 Academy Awards at the 63rd Academy Award ceremony, including Best Picture and Best Director. The score was integral to the film's success. Peter Buffett had composed an Oscar-winning song in the Herman Uihlein mansion. For the first time in its 71-year history, the house was famous for something unconnected to brewing. It was a recording studio where significant art had been created. Peter continued working from the mansion through 1991 and early 1992. But in 1992, he decided to relocate to New York City, where more opportunities existed for film and television composition. The move created an unexpected problem. The recording equipment installed on the third floor was substantial. Professional mixing consoles weighed hundreds of pounds. Soundboards were large and fragile. Specialized machinery had been assembled in rooms and could not be easily disassembled. The grand staircase with its ornate ironwork balustrade was too narrow to accommodate the equipment. The doorways throughout the mansion, designed for people rather than machinery, were too small. Colnik's 3 years of ironwork now trapped the recording equipment on the upper floor, like a medieval fortress trapping invaders. The solution was dramatic and probably horrified preservation specialists. A construction crew arrived and removed the roof. The tiles were carefully taken off. The underlying structure was exposed to the sky. A crane was positioned next to the mansion. The recording equipment was carefully extracted piece by piece through the open ceiling, lifted by crane cables and lowered to the ground, where it was loaded onto trucks. The entire operation took multiple days. Weather had to cooperate. Insurance coverage was probably extraordinary. A multi-million-dollar historic mansion listed on the National Register of Historic Places had been temporarily roofless so a musician could relocate to New York. The roof was replaced carefully, tiles reinstalled, structure restored. The mansion survived the operation. The next owners, Dr. Kailas Rao and his wife Becky, would purchase the property and begin the most extensive restoration in its history. Chapter 9. Restoration, Loss and Discovery. In 1992, Dr. Kailas Rao and his wife Becky purchased the mansion shortly after Peter Buffett's departure and began what would become a 3-year restoration project. The house had passed through religious institutional ownership, historic designation campaigns, and conversion to a recording studio. Systems needed comprehensive updating. Finishes required attention. The Raos approached the project not as renovation, but as restoration, an effort to return the mansion to its original glory while incorporating modern necessities. The work was described by those who witnessed it as extravagant in scope and ambition. The home and grounds received comprehensive attention. Original elements were preserved and restored where possible. Damaged plaster was repaired using period-appropriate techniques. Woodwork was cleaned and refinished. Floors were refinished. Paint colors were researched and matched to original schemes. Mechanical systems, heating, plumbing, electrical, were modernized while keeping interventions invisible. The restoration took 3 years of continuous work. Contractors, craftsmen, and specialists cycled through the mansion, addressing different systems and spaces. The Rouse lived through construction, committed to seeing the project through to completion. In 2003, they published a book documenting their restoration experience and the mansion's history, demonstrating the pride and near obsession the project had generated. The book was privately published and distributed to friends, family, and preservation organizations. It served as both memoir and architectural documentation. The Rouse eventually sold to another corporate executive who shared their appreciation for historic architecture and had the resources to maintain what they had restored. Tim Sullivan was chief executive officer of Bucyrus International, a Milwaukee area manufacturer of mining equipment, then moved to leadership positions at Gardner Denver, and later REV Group, Incorporated in Brookfield. His career trajectory was corporate executive, exactly the type of high-income professional who could afford a 13,000-square-foot mansion, requiring constant maintenance. Tim and his wife Vivian purchased the mansion in 2007 for $5 million. The price reflected both the property's significance and the substantial improvements the Rouse had completed. The Sullivans were not passive owners. They immediately began their own series of improvements, updating what the Rouse had restored and addressing elements that needed modernization. The kitchen was completely renovated in 2018 with new cabinetry, countertops, high-end appliances, and updated plumbing and electrical systems. Professional-grade cooking equipment was installed, the kind of kitchen a wealthy family uses not just for daily meals, but for entertaining with caterers and private chefs. New boiler and air conditioning systems were installed to properly climate control 13,717 square feet across 3 floors. The installation required 4 separate HVAC systems because no single system could efficiently heat and cool a structure this large with this many rooms. Bathrooms throughout the house were renovated with updated fixtures, new tile work, and modern plumbing while maintaining period-appropriate aesthetics. Electrical systems were modernized to handle contemporary loads, computers, televisions, security systems, and the countless devices that didn't exist when the mansion was built. Plumbing was updated to prevent the failures that plague old houses. Vivian Sullivan intentionally updated interiors to match what she understood as the flavor of the Uihlein's original decor, researching period-appropriate colors, materials, and furnishing styles while incorporating modern conveniences like Wi-Fi and smart home technology. The Sullivans owned the mansion for 16 years, longer than any owner since Claudia Uihlein left in 1946. They raised children there. They entertained guests. They maintained the property meticulously. But by 2019, their circumstances had changed. Their son lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. Their daughter lived independently in Milwaukee. The couple planned to split time between a condominium in Arizona and a smaller residence in the Milwaukee area. They no longer needed or wanted to maintain 23 rooms, 3 acres, and 4 HVAC systems. The mansion was listed for sale in 2019 with an asking price of $10 million. The listing emphasized the mansion's historic significance, architectural quality, recent improvements, and lakefront location. The marketing materials were professionally produced. The price seemed justified given comparable properties and the level of finish. The market response was silence. Months passed with no serious offers. Prospective buyers toured the property, admired the craftsmanship, and walked away. The reasons varied. Some found the mansion too large. Others were intimidated by maintenance costs. The property taxes alone exceeded what most Americans earn annually. Heating and cooling costs were enormous. Finding staff to maintain a house this size was difficult. The market for 13,000-square-foot historic mansions in Milwaukee, Wisconsin was limited. In 2021, the price was reduced to $6,950,000, a 31% reduction. Still no buyers emerged. The mansion sat on the market while the Sullivans waited. In 2023, the asking price dropped again to $5,950,000, now 41% below the original listing. The mansion that had cost $500,000 to build and had been purchased for $5 million in 2007 could not find a buyer at $6 million. In October of 2023, the Sullivans made a final decision. The mansion would be offered at auction through Sotheby's Concierge Auctions, with no reserve price. This meant the highest bidder would win, regardless of price. Starting bids were expected between $1,500,000 and $3,500,000. The auction was scheduled to run from November 3rd through November 14th. Conducted online with remote bidding, the house would sell to whoever bid highest. That same month, October 2023, another auction was announced. The timing was coincidental, but symbolically perfect. A great-great-grandson of Herman and Claudia Uihlein had made his own decision about the past. For somewhere between 60 and 80 years, hundreds of items from the Uihlein estate had remained in storage facilities around Milwaukee. Some items were stored properly in climate-controlled units. Others were stored in basic facilities on dirt floors where temperature and humidity fluctuated with seasons. Storage fees had accumulated for decades, compounding into substantial annual costs. The descendant decided to stop paying and liquidate the entire collection. He contacted Tark Durante, owner of Cedarburg Auction and Appraisal in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. Durante visited the storage facilities and was stunned by what he found. He later described the experience using language normally reserved for archaeology. Quote 8. The comparison was not hyperbole. Claudia Uihlein had placed these items in storage in 1946. Some had not been touched since. 760 items emerged from the storage units. The variety was extraordinary. A Louis XVI three-drawer desk from the 1740s with extremely detailed bronze dolphin and floral-decorated ormolu trims. A museum-quality piece of French furniture worth tens of thousands. A 22-piece baccarat crystal set with 8 champagne flutes, the kind of service wealthy families used for special occasions. Hand-painted double-handled Nippon vases from Japan. A handmade antique replica of Napoleon's carriage, elaborately detailed and displayed in a glass and gold case. A Meissen-style oil lamp in blue and white, in excellent condition despite more than 60 years in storage without climate control. A Wedgwood dinner service in Florentine bone turquoise pattern. Dozens of plates, bowls, serving dishes, and specialized pieces. Hundreds of additional pieces of fine china from various European manufacturers. Silk wedding dresses preserved in their original packaging, the fabric remarkably intact. Vintage hats from the 1920s and 30s showing the evolution of fashion during Claudia's lifetime. Classic artwork. Furniture that had once occupied the drawing rooms and bedrooms of the limestone mansion. Chairs, tables, cabinets, and decorative objects. Durante was struck by what was absent. There was no beer memorabilia. Despite the Schlitz Brewing fortune that had funded Herman's manufacturing business and provided the background wealth for the mansion, Claudia had collected as though the money came from old European aristocracy rather than American industry. No Schlitz advertising signs, no brewery commemorative pieces, no steins or glasses bearing the Schlitz name. No acknowledgement that beer money had made the European treasures possible. Claudia had deliberately separated her aesthetic world from the commercial source of wealth. She collected refinement, not industry. The storage auction was scheduled for October 2023. The same month, the mansion auction was announced. The confluence was remarkable. Herman and Claudia Uihlein's legacy was being liquidated simultaneously after being preserved separately for decades. The house would be sold to an anonymous buyer. The collections would be dispersed to hundreds of individual purchasers worldwide who would never see the mansion where these objects once lived. Collectors and dealers examined the items during preview days at the auction house. The quality was evident despite decades of storage. Some pieces showed wear, others looked nearly new. Bidding was conducted both online and in person, attracting participants from across the United States and internationally. The 760 items sold over several days in October 2023. Individual pieces commanded strong prices based on quality and rarity. The Louis XVI desk attracted competitive bidding from furniture specialists. The baccarat crystal sold to collectors who appreciated French glassmaking. The Napoleon carriage replica found a buyer fascinated by Napoleonic memorabilia. Each item found a new owner who appreciated the craftsmanship, if not the history. Most buyers probably had no idea these pieces had once furnished the mansion of a Brewing dynasty heir. The objects were separated from their context and scattered. The mansion auction proceeded in November as scheduled. Bidding was quieter than expected. The final sale was finalized in December 2023. The purchase price was $3,900,000. The buyer's agent was listed as Ajit Walia. The buyer's identity was not publicly disclosed. The new owner acquired one of Milwaukee's most significant historic residences for 61% less than the 2019 asking price. Tim and Vivian Sullivan had invested 16 years and millions of dollars into the mansion. They had purchased it for $5 million. They sold it for $3,900,000, losing $1,100,000 on the sale price alone. The renovations and improvements they had funded, the kitchen, the 4 HVAC systems, the bathrooms, the electrical and plumbing updates, represented additional hundreds of thousands in expenditure that the sale price did not recover. Individual collectors now owned pieces of Claudia's vision, displayed in homes across America and Europe, disconnected from each other and from the mansion where they once created a coherent whole. The mansion had a new owner whose name would remain private, whose plans for the property were unknown. The Schlitz fortune that had built it all was long gone, destroyed by shortcuts and quarterly thinking in boardrooms, far from the limestone palace on the bluff. Chapter 10. The Tomb Opens. When Claudia Uihlein left the mansion in 1946, 4 years after Herman's death, she did not simply walk away from 27 years of memories. She had spent decades assembling European collections. Furniture from France, crystal from Baccarat, china from England and Germany, artwork purchased during travels, decorative objects that represented her aesthetic education and refined taste. These were not merely possessions. They were expressions of who Claudia believed herself to be. She arranged for hundreds of items to be placed in storage. Some went to proper storage facilities with climate control and professional management. Others went to basic warehouse spaces where items sat on dirt floors and wooden crates, exposed to Milwaukee's temperature extremes, freezing winters and humid summers cycling through the decades. The storage was not meant to be permanent. Claudia likely intended to retrieve items for a smaller residence, to gift pieces to children and grandchildren, to eventually sort through what mattered and what could be released. But somehow the collections remained in storage. Years became decades. Claudia lived until 1982, dying at age 96. She had 36 years after leaving the mansion to reclaim her collections. She never did, whether from indifference, sentiment, inability to let go, or simply the inertia that accumulates around storage units. The items remained untouched. After her death, the collections passed to descendants who continued paying storage fees without examining what they were preserving. By 2023, the items had been in storage for somewhere between 60 and 80 years, depending on exactly when they were placed and which facility they occupied. Storage fees had compounded over decades. The costs had likely exceeded the original value of many items. A great-great-grandson of Herman and Claudia Uihlein finally made the decision Claudia had never made. Stop paying, liquidate everything, and close this chapter of family history. Tark Durante of Cedarburg Auction and Appraisal received the call and agreed to assess the collections. He visited multiple storage facilities across the Milwaukee area, unlocking units that had been sealed for decades. What he found astonished him. He had been in the auction business for years, handling estates and collections of all kinds. But this was different. He later told reporters it was urban archaeology, like opening a tomb that had been closed since the pharaohs. The comparison to archaeology was apt. These were not random objects, but a curated collection, frozen in time, representing early 20th century wealth and European-influenced American taste. Each item was a deliberate choice Claudia had made, purchasing during travels, selecting from dealers, commissioning from craftsmen. Together they formed a portrait of aspiration, of new American money trying to claim old European refinement. 760 items emerged. The French furniture included pieces from the Louis XVI period of the 1700s, chairs with carved frames, tables with marquetry inlays, a 3-drawer desk with bronze ormolu trim depicting dolphins and floral motifs. These were museum-quality pieces that would have been expensive when Claudia purchased them and had appreciated substantially. The desk alone could command tens of thousands at auction. The glassware included a 22-piece baccarat crystal set still in pristine condition. Baccarat was founded in 1764 and became the supplier to kings, emperors, and heads of state. Each piece was hand-blown by French craftsmen. The clarity of baccarat crystal was legendary, the weight substantial, the cutting precise. A complete service was exactly the kind of object wealthy Americans purchased to signal sophistication. The china collection numbered in the hundreds of pieces. Wedgwood from England in the Florentine bone turquoise pattern. Meissen-style pieces from Germany. Hand-painted Nippon vases from Japan showing the influence of Asian aesthetics on early 20th century American collecting. Each manufacturer represented centuries of tradition. Claudia had collected not just objects, but pedigrees, histories, and connections to European aristocratic traditions. The personal items were more poignant. Silk wedding dresses preserved in original packaging revealed Claudia's sentimentality. These were not practical items to store. They had no function and limited resale value. They were pure memory, physical embodiments of weddings, celebrations, and family milestones now forgotten by everyone except perhaps the descendants who had continued paying storage fees. The dresses had outlived the memories they were meant to preserve. Vintage hats from the 1920s and 30s showed the evolution of fashion during Claudia's adult life. Cloche hats from the 20s, broader brim styles from the 30s, each representing the taste of its era. These were not museum pieces, but actual accessories Claudia and her contemporaries had worn to parties, church services, and social events in Milwaukee's highest society. The Napoleon carriage replica was pure whimsy, a handmade miniature of Napoleon's state carriage, elaborately detailed and displayed in a glass and gold case. It had no practical purpose. It demonstrated wealth through frivolous perfection, the kind of object only someone with substantial disposable income would purchase and preserve. Durante was struck most by what was absent. There was no Schlitz memorabilia, no brewery advertising signs that would today be valuable as Americana. No commemorative steins or glasses, no corporate gifts or promotional items, despite the Uihlein family's century-long control of one of America's largest breweries. Claudia had collected as though the fortune came from inherited European wealth rather than American industrial manufacturing and beer sales. The deliberate separation was revealing. Claudia wanted European refinement, not industrial realism. She wanted to be associated with French furniture and baccarat crystal, not with beer barrels and brewery workers. The money came from beer, but the identity she constructed through collecting erased that source. The collection said, "We are cultured, we are sophisticated, we have taste." They did not say, "We made beer." The auction attracted collectors, dealers, and curious observers. Preview days allowed examination before bidding. The items were displayed in the auction house, removed from storage, and arranged for viewing. Collectors could hold the baccarat crystal, examine the ormolu details on the French desk, inspect condition and authenticity. Dealers calculated resale values and profit margins. Private collectors decided what they wanted to own. Bidding proceeded online and in person throughout October 2023. The 760 items sold individually to different buyers. The collections that Claudia had assembled to create a coherent whole were dispersed to dozens or hundreds of separate owners who would never see them together. The French desk might go to a furniture specialist in New York. The baccarat crystal might go to a collector in California. The Wedgwood might scatter to 3 different buyers. The Napoleon carriage found someone who collected Napoleonic memorabilia. The silk wedding dresses found a vintage clothing dealer who specialized in preserved garments. The Nippon vases found Asian art collectors. Each item went to whoever valued it highest at auction. Context was lost. The unified collection became isolated objects. The total proceeds from the auction were not publicly disclosed. Storage fees stopped accruing. The facilities were emptied and returned to the storage companies. 80 years of preservation ended with a 3-day auction that scattered everything Claudia had chosen to save. One question remained unanswered. Why had Claudia never retrieved the collections? She lived 36 years after leaving the mansion. She had time, money, and presumably the mental capacity to make decisions about possessions. Yet the items remained untouched from 1946 until 2023. The simplest explanation is inertia and avoidance. Confronting storage meant confronting the past, and Claudia chose not to. The collections existed in a state of suspended animation, neither used nor discarded, preserved but forgotten. Now they were scattered. The mansion survived. The collections dispersed. The brewing fortune vanished. What remained was limestone, iron, and questions about what preservation actually means. Chapter 11. What remains? The Herman Uihlein Mansion still occupies 5270 North Lake Drive in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin. The current owner, who purchased it for $3,900,000 in December 2023, maintains it as a private residence. It is not open to the public. There are no tours. No historic plaques mark the entrance. Colnik's wrought iron is visible from the street if you drive slowly past the fence and look carefully at the grand staircase through the windows. But that is the only public access to the craftsmanship. The mansion was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983. Wisconsin added it to the State Register of Historic Places in 1989. Whitefish Bay designated it an official historic landmark, adding local protections to state and federal oversight. These designations create a legal framework that prevents demolition or significant alteration without regulatory approval. The limestone will not be torn down to build condominiums. The ironwork will not be removed to install modern staircases. Future owners will be constrained by preservation law, but preservation law cannot answer deeper questions about value. The mansion cost $500,000 to build in 1919. It sold for $3,900,000 in 2023, a century later. That sounds like appreciation until you adjust for inflation. $500,000 $1919 equals approximately $9 million in 2023 purchasing power. The mansion sold for less than half its inflation-adjusted construction cost. As a financial investment, the Uihlein Mansion has been a catastrophic failure. The limestone lost value while the dollars were spent. Tim and Vivian Sullivan lost over $1 million on the purchase price alone, not counting the hundreds of thousands they invested in renovations, or the annual costs of property taxes, insurance, heating, cooling, maintenance, and staff. They owned the mansion for 16 years. The financial return was deeply negative. Whether that represents poor investment judgment or an acknowledgement that some things are worth preserving regardless of return on investment depends on what you believe wealth means. Herman Uihlein died in 1942 at age 56, never knowing the Schlitz Empire would collapse. He lived in the mansion for 23 years. He ran a successful manufacturing company, served on the Schlitz board, raised children in extraordinary privilege, and entertained Milwaukee society in rooms designed by his wife. The mansion was his home, not an investment. The distinction matters. Claudia lived in the mansion until 1946, then left and stored her collections for the next 36 years until her death in 1982 at age 96. Her European treasures survived 41 more years in storage before being sold to collectors who may never learn their history. The objects are scattered now, disconnected from the mansion and from each other, valued individually rather than as Claudia's coherent expression of taste. The question is not what the mansion is worth in dollars. The question is what endures. The limestone quarried in Indiana in 1918 is still solid. The walls have not cracked. The foundation has not failed. Colnik's ironwork has not rusted. The craftsmanship endures while the fortune that paid for it vanished. One approach to wealth, patient craftsmanship, expensive materials, 3 years of ironwork, created something that has lasted 106 years and will likely last another 100. Another approach to wealth, quarterly profit margins, cost-cutting, accelerated production, destroyed a century-old empire in less than a decade. Whether limestone represents real value or simply a different kind of impermanence depends on what you believe truly lasts. The brewing fortune is gone now, converted to historical footnotes and business school case studies about catastrophic management failure. The mansion remains, protected by law and sustained by owners who choose preservation over profit. Whether that choice is wise or sentimental, whether it represents triumph or stubborn refusal to accept economic reality, whether Colnik's 3-year ironwork marathon created more value than decades of empire management, These questions have no definitive answers. Only time decides what was worth preserving and what was worth destroying.